everyone, and welcome to our latest Code Presents webinar, EF Core 6, Fulfilling the Bucket List, presented by code author and entity framework expert, Julie Lerman. We're thrilled to have Julie joining us today, and we're looking forward to listening to her present on the latest Entity Framework 6 updates. Julie's presentation today is directly related to her Code Focus issue article of the same title. I've included a link here if you want to refer to the article during or after the presentation. My name is Jim Duffy, and I'm responsible for the marketing and sales efforts for all of our code services, including Code Magazine, of course, but Code is so much more than just a magazine. Code's continuing mission is to help people build better software. We're a Microsoft partner and provide a number of services under the Code brand umbrella, including building custom software solutions on-prem and in the cloud, modernizing legacy applications, educating developers, providing developer resources to augment your development team, and supporting and maintaining existing applications. Our team of expert developers and consultants are ready to help you with your project. Our free hour of code is one of our most popular free services. It's a free hour on us. No strings, no commitment, no credit card required, just free help from our code experts. It provides an opportunity for you and your team to meet with our handpicked expert team to discuss anything you could use our help with. Slots are limited, so reach out to me today about getting a free hour of code scheduled for you and your team. We are hiring React developers. Come join the code consulting team. We have multiple junior and senior React positions currently open, remote and on-site. Full-time and contractor positions are available. Follow the link for all the details. Looking for a new gig? We're always looking for talented developers to join the code team. Check out our jobs page for our open positions. If you're interested in writing for Code Magazine, check out our Writing for Code page. Our code staffing division can help you find the development talent you're looking for to help augment your development teams. If you like what you see today or have seen in our prior webinars, please subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on Twitter, and like us on Facebook. Code Magazine is the leading software development magazine written by expert developers for developers. All registered attendees who don't already subscribe will automatically receive a free digital Code Magazine subscription. I've also included a free subscription link here for you to freely share with others who couldn't make it to the webinar. We would like your feedback about this webinar in the form of a quick survey, and we're willing to pay $100 in the form of an Amazon Eat card to one lucky attendee. A name will be drawn from the entire webinar's registered attendee list, and a completed survey is required to qualify for the e-card. If the selected name hasn't completed a survey, another name is selected, and so on. Fill out a very short survey, and don't be that person whose name is selected only to lose out because you didn't complete the survey. The survey link is on the slide, and we'll post the survey link in the chat window as well. Just a quick shout out here about Photino. Photino is an open source project the code team is involved with that allows .NET developers to create native cross-platform desktop applications using web development technology. You can leverage your HTML, CSS, and JavaScript skills to create desktop applications that run on Windows, Linux, and the Mac. It's like Electron, only smaller and much more lightweight. Learn more at tryphotino.io. The slides and recording of today's webinar, and all our webinars, will be available on the Code Presents page on the Code website. I've included the links here. Our presenter today is my friend Julie Lerman. Julie is a popular Code Magazine author, an experienced software developer, a popular conference speaker, a Microsoft regional director, a Microsoft MVP, a Pluralsight author, and a Docker captain. If this is your first time attending one of our webinars, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us. If you've attended one of our webinars in the past, welcome back. Okay, you've heard enough from me. Thanks for listening. Take it away, Julie.
Hello, hello. Okay, first thing we need to know is, can you hear me? All right, I know you can because YouTube was echoing. I'll turn off that one. There, now I don't get the echo. All right, well, I'm so excited to be doing this, and yeah, writing that article for Code Magazine actually was the trigger for creating this presentation. So I just keep digging further and further into all of that information. So if you haven't read that article, it's part of the issue where it's just like all .NET 6 content, a lot of it from program managers at Microsoft. But the Entity Framework Core team was very generous, asking me to write the article on their behalf. So that was really awesome. Anyway, so what I'm going to present today, I've called this, just like the article, EF Core 6 Working on the Bucket List. And I titled it this and the article because this version of EF Core, the team really finally got to work on some things that they have been really wanting to get to and also have been high on developers' minds. But they really had to get other things set up and stable before they could get to this. So this was their bucket list. It's not complete. That's why they're working on it, but they definitely are working on that bucket list. So somebody asked in the YouTube chat if I've got another Pluralsight course coming, and I am working, just so you know, on it's going to be called EF Core 6 Fundamentals. So Pluralsight's changed things a little bit. It's going to be a much more epic course, a much bigger course than my typical Entity Framework Getting Started courses. So I am working on that. It's going to be a little while longer, a little bit of work. So in this session, well, it would be really nice to tell you every single new thing about EF Core 6. That's not really possible in an hour. So I'm going to focus on some really high impact changes and some things that have been highly requested, as well as some more parity with EF6, some features, and also just some other changes that I am really interested in. So I'll do some demos and then the rest will just, have to be slides because there's just, there's only so much time. I do think it's important to be aware of timing with EF Core 6 and .NET 6. So you probably know by now, or you might know by now, that they're on about a annual cadence. So EF Core 5 and .NET 5 came out in November 2020. EF Core 6 and .NET 6 came out November 2021, and they're planning to have EF Core 7 and .NET 7 come out in November 2022. Another important thing is to be aware of the difference between the long-term support for versions and others that don't have long-term support. So EF Core 6 will be a long-term support. That doesn't mean that the other ones go away. It just means that it's just more like you can call up and get help with it. So EF Core 5 support, that's not long-term. That ends in May 2022. And EF Core 3.1 support, that was LTS, that ends at the end of end of this year. So, and that also aligns with .NET, the .NET long-term support. And it's not called short-term support. It just suddenly flew out of my head. So not long-term support. Another important thing to be aware of with EF Core 6 is that it is dependent on .NET 6. You cannot use it on .NET 5. You cannot use it on .NET Standard. Not being able to use it on .NET Standard also means it's no longer supported on plain old .NET Framework, right? Because .NET Framework sits on top of .NET Standard. So it only will run on .NET 6. With that, it's also important to be aware of the tooling, right? Because in order to use EF Core 6, you have to have .NET 6. In order to code in .NET 6, you need either Visual Studio 2022, so Windows or Mac, Visual Studio Code, JetBrains Writer, but not like Visual Studio 2019, right? So that's just kind of just get some housekeeping about that out of the way. So features. Biggest, this is the biggest thing, I think, the team thinks, a lot of people think, is query performance has improved dramatically. They really, really, they said, we are going to focus on this, and focus they did. What they did, they needed kind of they needed a target. And what they wanted to do was reduce the performance gap between Entity Framework and Dapper. So that doesn't mean they're competing with Dapper. It's really important to take advantage of, I'll have a lot of arrows in your quiver, right? Take advantage of the right tool for the right job. But at least, the performance shouldn't be such a big deciding factor between Dapper and Entity Framework Core. So the way they did this was they focused on what's called the Tech Empower Fortunes benchmark. So that's like the standard that all kinds of software uses to measure. So you measure runtime performance so that you can always be comparing apples to apples. So there's a lot of constraints and rules about how you design the software that you use for testing, and it's done in like really lab environments. So using that as the I want to say the apple for the apples to apples, using Tech Empower Fortunes, they compared EF Core 5 and EF Core 6 to Dapper, not even thinking about Dapper. They were using Dapper as kind of their carrot on a stick, but comparing EF Core 5 to EF Core 6, and this is a very specific comparison. It's not just EF Core 5 and EF Core 6, it's the whole package for an application. So .NET 5, ASP.NET Core 5, and EF Core 5 compared to .NET 6. Now, .NET 6 also gave us huge performance gains as well. So a combination of .NET 6, ASP.NET Core 6, and EF Core 6. They say it's 70 based on lab-based, like really constrained testing. They say that combination is 70% faster. When they take out the improvements that are relevant to .NET 6 and ASP.NET Core 6 and really are comparing just EF Core 6 and EF Core 5 for querying, they came up with that it's about 30% faster. And again, the measurements are pretty particular. So this is using like the most, they're with .NET 5, EF Core 5 and 6, they're using the most efficient way. So it was like on Linux using PostgreSQL, things like that. So that's just kind of an overview, like just, overall, it's about 30% faster than it was. So this is just some data from the Tech Empower Fortunes tests and what it's showing. So you know what it is I'm looking at. So that first line, that starting point is saying, okay, here's EF Core 5 and .NET 5. And those numbers under EF Core and Dapper are reads per second. Like, so its ability to read per second. So you can see that, when they started, like their baseline, Dapper was like more than twice as fast as EF Core. So the first thing they had to do was get their software, their tests in line with what the benchmark expects. So just doing that, they already had an improvement. So now they're really comparing apples to apples. Then they said, okay, now let's move from .NET 5 to .NET 6. That gave them a little more performance gain. And Dapper also gained and benefited from the .NET 6 performance. Then when they said, okay, now we're making changes to the APIs in EF Core, so now we're moving from EF Core 5 to EF Core 6. Now overall, that they went from 150,000 reads per second to 250,000 reads per second. So that's where that's overall it's 70% faster, but that's where they're getting the 30%. And it's also interesting, if you haven't seen the Tech Empower benchmarks, bring that over here just a second. Okay, so this actually, the actual benchmarks, if you look at the top up here, the latest round was a year ago, right? So the latest official round, officially published round, doesn't reflect EF Core 6. But what I'm looking at here is unofficial, and these are updated, like, sometimes multiple times a day. So if you start with the official, and I can tell you that the EF Core 5 is all the way down here. So this is when you've got a combination of ASP.NET Core, .NET Kestrel on Linux, PostgreSQL on Linux, EF, it's, says full ORM there. It's kind of tiny, but it does say EF here. So EF was way down here at 93. And there's Dapper actually at 91 doing comparison. Now I'm going back to the unofficial results. So this might have been, published an hour ago, who knows? And EF Core is down in the 40s now. Here's ASP.NET Core, Postgres, and EF down in the 40s. Dapper is up here, but anyway, so overall, like in the whole scheme of any application, any web app you might be building, right? This really just came way up in terms of performance. So it was really kind of interesting looking into the Tech and Power benchmarks. And I even asked, "Oh, can I run that? Can I run that on my computer?" And they're like, "No, you need multiple servers, and this is like this whole crazy setup." So I was just looking at that. So what kinds of changes did they make to help that really had these impacts on query performance? So one of the big things they did, you may be familiar with the fact that we've had DB context pooling in EF Core for quite a while now. So what they did was they extended pooling to DB connections, DB commands, data readers, and some other things. And that actually really had this, 23% really big impact on the performance. Another place they were able to reduce the amount of time being spent was in how they're doing logging. So the way logging was working, and also when you're using the interceptors, they're like constantly checking, and that was interfering with the queries. They were doing that while querying was going on. So now they're doing that in a less often, but still so frequently that you're still getting the same information that you need. And another this is really interesting. The first two I mentioned, they just happened. The other one is an opt-in. And you've got thread safety checks, right, that you run in your applications. So you can actually disable, once you've done all your debugging and testing and everything, and you go to production, you can actually disable the thread safety checks. And there was another 6.5% increase. So all kinds of stuff they did here to do it. That's just a little bit of it. There's links down here, down at the bottom. You can go and really get into the nitty-gritty details of what they did, but these were like the three big ones. Another really important thing to understand about this, again, it's query performance, but for EF Core 6, they focused on non-tracking queries, because you may be aware, when any framework core is tracking, there's definitely more work that any framework core is doing, the DB context is doing, when in creating the entity entry tracking objects and all of that. So the real focus for this and all the improvement that we've gotten was really focused on all the things that were happening that were related to tracking. And their plan is for EF Core 7, now they're going to take everything they learned and start digging into tracked queries to try to bring that the performance of that up as well. So I also, since I couldn't run the big benchmarks, what I did was I created a small test. I call them my backyard benchmarks, right? It's just like on my computer. And it was just, I just wanted to do a little bit so that I could see something. And So I wrote I with some help from people on the team because I want to make sure I was doing it right. Wrote some little tests, which I ran in EF Core 5, and I'm using benchmark.net, which you have, if you've never used that, it's a really, really awesome tool from the .NET team. I could go into great detail about that, but I'm not doing that today. So using benchmark.net, I built these little tests. One uses EF Core 5 on .NET 6. So again, I was, trying to take just focus on the EF Core APIs, right? So they're both running on .NET 6. And what I did was query for 1,000 rows and another query for 1 row. And I did this big difference for a reason. So if you look at the differences, so when I did 1,000 rows in EF Core 5 versus EF Core 6, you can see EF Core 6 was about twice as fast, right? 3,000 versus about 1,500. But I also wanted you to see that you're not going to see that if you're just testing with one record, you're not really going to see much difference at all. I'll just show you very quickly, and I'll upload this code so you can look at it more carefully. And this is written very, very specifically to only really focus on the actual execution of the query. So I'm taking out all the other anomalies. I'm, using functions so that I'm not taking into account even like instantiating the DB context, things like that. So, in the end, it's really the apples to apples is just this little bit of code here where I've got a pooled factory, right? So I'm taking advantage of the pooling, creating a DB context, and then running this 1K query, which is defined up here, which just, pulls 1,000 rows from a big database with a lot of data, Stack Overflow database that I grabbed. And the only other thing about this, so this is the 6. If you do get my demos, there's a branch for EF Core 6 perf and a branch for EF Core 5 perf. And the only thing you'll find different in them, based on the way I set this up, is that in the EF Core 6 one, I'm taking advantage of the new enable thread safety checks feature. So I'm disabling that just to see, really where can we go. So you can look at that more deeply by looking at my demos when you're ready. But I'm going to move on. So this, the team's really, really proud of that work with the query performance, but they also did other things for performance. So one of them is startup performance, and the way that we can have better startup is they targeted the model compilation. So we actually had some capability to pre-compile models in EF6. I wonder if it came in EF5. I think it came in EF6, not Core, but back then. But when we got EF Core, we didn't have that capability. So they've brought it back, but they've approached it in a much different way. So I do want to make sure you understand where, in terms of model compilation, where it is that you typically pay the price. It's not when you instantiate the DB context. It's that very first time in an application instance that the DB context actually is trying to do something with the database, like the first query or the first save changes, or if there's something else, like maybe ensure created on the database or something, that first interaction. So the context is already instantiated, it's aware of the connection string, but it's not until that very first time that it says, oh, wait, I got to go read the DB context and read the classes and read the configurations and figure everything out, right? And then once it's figured out that model, then it just stays in memory for the lifetime of the application, right? So it doesn't have to do it again. It doesn't have to do it on any subsequent interactions. So the focus then for this particular improvement was, when it's time to trigger that compilation, like, how can we take that out, right? So we're pre-compile it and then just say, okay, just use use what we precompiled. So before I show you how it works, I do have a little demo, but my demo, it would never get near being able to show you the performance benefit, because in order to do that, you really need to have a big model. And being somebody who focuses a lot on domain-driven design, I'm always like, well, why would anybody have a big model, right? And talking to Arthur and other people on the team, they're like, there are a lot of people that have really huge models, and and they needed this help, right? Instead of saying, well, just don't design it that way, because if you've got legacy stuff that you're bringing forward, you just that there's all kinds of reasons why people might have huge models. So Arthur created this big. Arthur Vickers is on the team, and he created a demo that has huge model. Like if you were to look at a picture of what the model looked like, there'd just be like a million little boxes and 5,000 lines. Actually, 720 lines, right? 720 relationships, right? So there's a lot going on in this model. So pre-compiling a model like that is definitely going to give you a benefit. So what he found with his demo, and this was, I actually reran his demo on my computer right before it was released. So I was still on an RC version, but it was just, right almost before the release. Anyway, so you can see here the time to the first, so the way he was triggering it was he ran a query, right? So that on running that query, that's that first time that the model gets compiled. So just doing it on the fly the normal way, it was taking 1.8 seconds, which, I'd be like, I'm leaving, I'm leaving the website, right? If that's happening. Of course, a website doesn't have to start up application instances that often, hopefully. Anyway, so the difference between doing it on the fly and having a precompiled model in his scenario with that model was, like 11 times, I think, about, right? A little more than 10 times faster. So you can actually grab that demo from his GitHub site. But, so that's actually better proof in the pudding than the demo that I'm going to show you. So how do you pre-compile models? Whether using the CLI or using PowerShell commands. CLI, it's .NET EFDB context optimize or optimize -db context. So that creates a folder in your project, and it creates a whole bunch of files that are optimized versions of your classes in your application. So that's step one, creating those optimized models. But then step two is making sure your DB context knows at runtime, instead of doing the compilation, when that time comes, go and use my precompiled model. So I'll just show you how that works, because, you got a code, right? So I have all these in branches, so I just have to go from one to another. Compiled models before, and yeah, and then Visual Studio Code hates me doing this constantly. And I just want to make sure it's all set. Yeah, okay. Control Alt O to give ReSharper a kick, and that should be okay. Okay, so this is not a huge model, right? It's really, really tiny. I have two classes, a person class, just a few properties in it, an address class, just a few properties. It does have an enum, so fancy, right? And then there's relationship, one-to-many relationship between person and addresses, and there's the enum. That's it. Simple, simple. And then my context class doesn't really do much at all. Just ignore the squiggly lines. Everything's okay here. This is just, like I said, resharpers. Just pissy. There. I just gave resharper another kick. By the way, it took me a while to figure out how to do that. To the kicking resharper. keep saying resharper, OmniSharp, kicking OmniSharp. Maybe I also need to compile this, but you see this keeps going back and forth. So it's Control-Alt-0 in Visual Studio Code, just in case you ever need to do that. So really nothing going on here, right? I'm not overriding any configurations or anything. So it's really, really simple. So to create those, I'll do .NET EF DB context optimize. And it's building. Yeah. Okay. So now we have a new folder here, and it created representations of each of my types. So here's what's interesting here is when EF Core compile, when Entity Framework worked this way too. When it's time to compile the models, EF Core looks at the DB context, figures out all of the classes that are involved, goes and reads those classes to find out everything it needs to know, then goes and reads any configurations, whether you've got data annotations or using Fluent API and DB context, right? It has to go figure all of that stuff out. So what this is doing is putting everything you could possibly need to know. Like, it's not even going to depend on convention. It's everything is completely explicit. Every single thing it could possibly know is expressed in these entity type classes, right? And then here's address entity type, right? So it doesn't have to, it doesn't have to think at all. It's all explicitly specified here. And here also there's information about the one-to-many relationship down there, foreign key, right? So it's got all that in there. Then it creates its own little version of the model, and the model does this thing called initialize, and initialize is actually tucked in here, and because it's a partial class, and what that does is, spins up all of this entity types that it has created. Okay, so all of that stuff is in there. I'm going to just throw a breakpoint in a couple of places so we can see this actually getting used. I'll do it there. Okay, so that's what it created, but it's not going to get used unless I tell the DB context to use model. And it's people context. Oh, go away. Thank you. Model dot instance. I'm not getting IntelliSense because this is in a different namespace. Come on. Okay, that's it. That's all I have to do. So now I'm going to run this, and all I'm going to do here is run it. So the reason I'm running it is so that you can see that because of this, it's going to, well, I should have shown you there's, I have a program file, right? I have a program file that actually does something. So it does, it creates the database, makes sure the database is created, and it just does an insertion, right? So this is going to be the thing that triggers. Actually, no, because I'm doing ensure created, this is what's actually going to be triggering it. Anyway, you can see that it's going into my special files to read the information it needs to know. So in this setup, you're never going to see a performance improvement because it's just the silliest little model. And just want to do this, just makes it easier to move on. Anyway, so that's how that works. But the numbers I showed you from Arthur's demo are why it works. And so back to the PowerPoints. I'm watching the time. So I do want to say I've done this talk in an hour. I had to do it once in a half an hour. So after that, I was like, no, I want to say as much as I want about every single one of these things. So I started creating these YouTube videos. So the very first video is almost an hour long, and it's just talking about the query performance, right? That's how much I have to say about all these things, but I just, give you enough high level information. So this next thing also is this next improvement is something we've had different ways of doing it, and the team just wanted to find a better way to make migrations easier, especially when it comes to, doing DevOps, right? Like deploying your apps and deploying migrations. So getting your migrations into testing, CI/CD, getting your migrations maybe even into production. If I have different feelings about the last piece, right? Most people want to have a little more control over that, but especially CI/CD is really important. So the feature is referred to as migrations bundles. And some of you may have experienced this before. How do we deploy migrations, right? So one way that people think of doing, seems like a good idea, is to put it in app startup, because there's actually a migrate command. So to, keep the migrations with the application when you deploy it, and then hit, run migrate when the application starts up. That's fine if you have one instance of your application running, in the cloud. But if you have multiple instances, if maybe you've got it in containers and your application is growing and new containers are being spun up, et cetera, you've got a potential. I mean, it's the timing has to be just right, but you've got this potential of having a race condition with two instances trying to run the migration on the same database at the same time, right? So it's just like, do not do that. And even in the docs, the team mentions, like, please don't do that. It's not really a good idea. So other ways we deal with that is to take advantage of the ability to generate SQL from migrations, and then let your favorite tool apply them for you. I really love using FlyawayDB to help with that, especially when I'm doing continuous integration and want automated tests running online. It's a great solution. I've got go to my YouTube. I have all of my conference presentations that are on YouTube. I've actually compiled them into a list. So I've done a presentation on that in a couple of places. You could find that. Really cool solution. And another now is the ability to bundle up those migrations into an executable, and then you just run the executable depending on, where that's happening, whether it's in a container, et cetera. I am only going to demonstrate that in Visual Studio Code on my computer, that last piece. So it's, again, we've got, command line or PowerShell. So it's .NET EF migrations bundle, or bundle-migrations. And there are a whole bunch of options. I think the most important are that you can specify the name of the output file that it gets bundled into. You can specify that it can be self-contained, which means that in that compiled executable, the .NET 6, all the binaries that are necessary will be there. So you wouldn't even need to have .NET Core or .NET 6 installed on, like, say it's a container, right? You wouldn't even need it there because it's all in one place. So that makes a much bigger file. Force is just to override it if you're just using this, you want to overwrite the file. So what it creates is a file called efbundle or efbundle.exe, and then we just run that file, and that will run the migration. There's a couple of things to be aware of. First of all, you can pass in a parameter that's a connection, and the other, which, again, like if I had a lot more time, I would love to demonstrate all of this. It's actually idempotent, right? So it puts everything in there. Even if you have like 6 migrations, it'll put all of the migrations in there, but then it checks to see, has this one already been run? Has that one already been run, et cetera. So, so it is idempotent, and, it won't mess with your data or anything. I've like tested all of that stuff. So I'll just show you quickly what that looks like in code to do it. And not compiled. It's down here somewhere. Bundles. Okay. So I do have, yeah, Visual Studio Code. I know. I do have just one migration in here, right? And nothing else. It's clean. So I'm just going to go over to the terminal. I mean, there's really not a lot I want to say. This is like the initial migration that creates for the first creation. So, create database is not inside the migration file. Part of migrations, they will check to see if the database exists yet, and that will create it, and then runs what's in the file. But this is really the initial thing for creating the people. It's the same model, people, addresses, right, and the one-to-many relationship. So that's all that is. And so it's just .NET EF migrations bundle, and it will build. And Visual Studio Code will keep whining. Shush. And again, Visual Studio Code's great. This is just because I'm going back and forth to branches and just using it in a kind of a strange way. So you can see it built and compiled. It built the model, and then it created EF bundle exe, which is right here. Okay, so I can then just run EF bundle. And notice it says it's applying that migration, right? So if I had more time, make a change, create a new migration. Now there's 2 migrations in there. The if I bundled it again, if I created a whole new bundle, like deleted this one or, overwrote this bundle, it's a whole new bundle. Both migrations will be in there, and it will figure out which, if it needs, if the database already exists and the migration was there, the first migration was there, it skips over it. So you can see, like, you could see it saying, like just applied number 2, right? And number 1 wouldn't be there. Anyway, here's the database it just created. And I'm using SQLite Explorer, which is an extension of Visual Studio Code. So this, this just created this table, right? So I could run some code, populate some data in the table, then make a modification to one of the types, create a new migration file, and then run migrations bundle again over, and force overwrite EF bundle. And, you could see all that. Imagine all of that happening. It was a lot faster to explain it than to do it. So being able to do that, right? So, the point is, obviously, you're not going to do that just so that you can run EF bundle on your development, on, the same development machine, right? I could have just run the migration, use the migration command. So the point is that once you've got this, now you have a file that you can use as part of your deployment of your application and throughout your CI/CD process. So that's the point of that. But, it was just easier and quicker to just run it right here. Okay. Speaking of time, looking at the time again, temporal table support. So this is a feature that a lot of people were asking for. And I saw this, come up and be discussed as one of the new features of EF Core 6. And I've only been programming for a little over 30 years and using SQL Server and relational databases for many of those years. And I said, oh, what's temporal tables? I never heard of them before. So I am not going to make an assumption that other people here know what it is either. So I give you just a quick overview of what even temporal tables are. And once I understood what temporal tables are, and therefore was able to understand the support EF Core 6 has for them, I was like, oh, I totally get it, and I see why they're really, really powerful. So temporal tables actually, it's is it a specification for SQL? So a lot of relational databases have it. They implement it in their own way. So this is just looking at SQL Server, and these are views, like screenshots from SQL Server Management Studio. So a temporal table, as per SQL Server, is referred to as a system versioned table, and it has within it a subtable. It's a history. It's called a history table, but it's like a subtable that is a mirror of the table itself. So it's got all of the same, notice all of the same columns in it, right? But what's interesting is, notice that, this is important. I have this period end and period start columns also in both of them. So that's important to have if you have temporal tables. It's kind of required. And with the EF Core 6 support, you don't have to think about that even. It just happens. But what SQL Server will do is, anytime, like if a change comes in for a row, it'll make a snapshot of, if it's, say it's an edit, right? So it'll make a snapshot of the original version of the row in the history table, and it'll update the period end and period start. So the period end was, until I just made that change, and the period start was, the previous time. And then it creates and then updates the values in the main table, and makes sure that the period end and period start fields or columns reflect that, like period end would be forever, right? Because there's no end yet, because this is what's current, and period start would be like, that moment I made the update. So, imagine the same things that it does for deleted rows, right? It persists the row in the history table, and then removes it from the main table. And a new row, it has copies in. Does it have a copy in the history table? I can't remember. But hey, just learning about them for the first time. So that's actually really, really great, right? Because you can go in, and with EF Core and with SQL Server, has all kinds of query capabilities around temporal data, like, and the other databases as well. So you can say, go show me, these rows, what they were as of like this day, right? So if some of them are in the current normal part of the database, it'll return those. And if some of them are history because they've been updated since that date, then it'll give you a combination as needed. And there's all kinds of different ways of interacting with that data in SQL Server. So EF Core 6 now has a way to work with this. First of all, the trigger is that in the mapping of the in your mapping for your migrations, not your migration, sorry, in the DB context, when you're configuring it, we just have a new method, a new property called isTemporal, right? That's it. Actually, method. So that's just a flag. And then what that will do is, let me just flip over to here. go away changes, delete the files. Might as well just show you in here instead of on the slide, but you can always go back and look at the slide. Okay, so in here, on model creating, right, there it is. ToTable is temporal, right? So we're using ToTable to specify a different than default name for the table, right? But also we can say it's temporal. So that's it. Then the migration files that get generated from that have all kinds of information in them related to the temporal table. The fact that I said it was temporal. So they've got all these annotations. The other thing is, if we look at the domain model, there's nothing here about the start and end dates, right, related to the temporal tables, because that has nothing to do with our business logic. But in here, in the migration, because it said it was temporal, it has created these two columns for me, right? And you can specify, you can overwrite what those names are going to be in your configuration. So all the information it needs about creating the temporal table is in there, and EF Core makes sure that you get the period end and period start. And also for SQL Server, they have to be date time 2 fields. But again, like EF Core will take care of that for you, so don't have to worry about how that works. Then the T-SQL, I'm just going to show you what the T-SQL looks like that gets generated. And this is what you would have to know if you were doing this kind of manually in SQL Server, right? So there's, it's creating the table, there's the period end and period start, and also other attributes that SQL Server needs to know. And right, it's, period for system time. It's just saying which of these it's just specifying these are the columns that are going to be used for versioning, right? And just all this different versioning information. So what I want to do is I actually already created a little database and seeded it. I'm just going to run this again, just seeded it with some data. So this is using that temporal tables, the temporal tables in that database I called temporal test, that the code I just showed you will have or has created, because I ran migration to make sure it got created. So you can see that when I first ran this, it populated the period end. Remember I said it goes to, the end is forever because there's no end. That's the current data. And the start this was actually when these rows got inserted. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to update one of these rows. So there's George Jetson, and I'm going to change his last name to Jones. And then I'm just going to run this again. So you can see now that this is SQL Server is doing all this, right? It just automatically does it. You don't have to worry about doing it. So there's George Jones, and you can see it's still the period end is there, but you can see that its period start date is different, right? Because I did it 2 whole seconds later. 2 hours later than the last time when I created the table. So here's what a SQL query looks like. I'll just say, show me what the data looked like as of like 1655. So after I initially created those things. So again, this is just T-SQL, but I just want you to see that in, the database is what's responsible for that. It pulled back, it said, oh, well, back then it was George Jetson, right? So it has the ability, it's kind of crossing from the main table to the history table to respond to that. So we have, so the migration SQL, I showed you that. So we have a bunch of link methods now for querying temporal tables. And So I have this method here called temporal query. This is what I already ran to seed it earlier. And I just need to change this audit date. So this is just saying, first of all, I'm setting up an audit date, and I just have to go back and look at that because I don't remember. So 1655 should get it. 1655. Okay, so I'm specifying the date to query on, and then I'm just saying, look at the people table and use the temporal as of method, and I'm passing in that date time stamp. Okay, so I'll just make sure I've got breakpoints here. So I've got 2 queries here. This is just pull me regular data, right? Just from the table. Don't even think about the history table. But this one is saying, hey, if there's information you need from the history table, get that as well. So I'll go press F5. Yes, I'm actually running code. Okay, so first, the regular result, just we care about George, right? George Jones, right? That's the latest thing. The other thing to note is, notice it's not bringing back those 2 columns, right? Like, because they're extra. They're just specific to the database. They don't really have anything to do with our business logic. And remember, they aren't part of the person object anyway, or the address object. They were just specific to working in the database. So they aren't there. So anyway, the first one brought back George Jones, and now I put the breakpoint in the wrong place. Okay, just do it again. I want my demos to work the way I want my demos to work. Okay, so now I'm going to just step into that. And we can see this time when I use the temporal as of, I'm getting George Jetson, which was what the data looked like at that time. So what I'm going to do now is, we do have 15 more minutes. So I'm going to take a few more minutes to whip through just some more interesting things to let you know about. And then I'll try to leave 5 or 10 minutes for Q&A. I hope that's cool. So this is also really important that we've got support now for specifying conventions and conversions in a bulk way. We could never do that before. So just so you know what I'm talking about, say SQL Server by default specifies that whenever it has a string, by default, it will assume that in the database, that is an nvarchar 4000, right? And maybe that's not the default that you want. So the way we've always had to change that in the DB context is, and it's not discoverable by any means. Iterate, like look at the model builder, iterate through all of the entity types, right? And then anytime it finds a string, set the column type to nvarchar 100, right? Because there was just no other way to do it. So now there's another way to do it. We can also, if you were just going to do a one-off. So now we have column type, and there's a few others. So just to compare, right, the old way of doing it to the new way, we have this new thing called the configurations builder, right? And this just code is saying for every string property, it should have a column type of nvarchar 100. It's so much better. So here are a few things. So first of all, we have a new method in the DB context, and it's called configure conventions, and it gives us a model configurations builder to work with to specify. So there's the first one. I'm using configuration builder and saying, anytime you see a string property, make sure its database column type is an nvarchar 100. So that's one benefit. And also, if you use custom conversions, you can leverage this new capability with them also. So for example, enums by default would be mapped to integers in the database, but you might want them to be mapped to strings, right? So a lot of people do that, and then we actually have to specify it for every single property in your model that's using that enum. You would have to actually specify an individual conversion. Now you can say any time you see a property anywhere in any one of the entities that is an address type enum, convert it to a string. Make sure that in the database it's a string, and also knows to go when you're doing querying. Obviously, it comes back and forth properly. And another one is if you've ever done custom conversions. I always like using color as a custom conversion because there's no way to store the color. It's not a class struct. It's a struct in .NET. So there's no way to naturally store a color struct. And again, you could use conversions, value conversions, in EF Core up and you can still use value conversions to do this. But again, you'd have to do one property at a time. So if you had a lot of color properties throughout your model, you'd have to have a lot of statements. There was no way to have a sweeping one. So now we have a way to do a sweeping one. I'm going to skip over this. A couple other things. Cosmos DB had a lot of improvements. I love I love working with Cosmos DB, and I really like the fact that EF Core makes it easy for me to work with Cosmos DB so that I don't have to go and learn yet another client API for interacting with it. So they've been making more and more improvements. And what's really cool about this is in the same way that EF Core has a relational API, and then the SQL Server API sits on top of that, SQLite sits on top of that, etc. So the work they're doing here for Cosmos DB will eventually be enable us to have other document DB providers. So that's kind of cool. So a few things, and especially for GDD friendly things being done to EF Core. A relational database, like the idea of having our value objects, or owns one, owns many, which can also be used for value objects. A relational database doesn't really support how value objects work very well, but a document database does, because you can literally embed them. And now with the Cosmos provider, by default, because it makes perfect sense to be able to embed owned objects within each other, it just will do that by default, so you don't have to map it with owns one or owns many. So I really, really like that. Like, it makes sense. And also, by the way, will by default nest objects. If you have a relationship, like say one-to-many with addresses, if there's no DB set for the addresses, then it will assume, oh, and that's actually what I'm doing here. That's the one to the right-hand one is that example. The addresses will automatically, if there's no DB set in the DB context, those addresses, those child objects will also get embedded into there. There's more logging details coming back from Cosmos DB if you're doing logging. So that's really, really helpful. It also knows how to store collections and dictionaries of primitives. Again, just because it knows how to embed, it's JSON, right? So it knows how to construct JSON. So this is something you can't do with a relational database. So if you're using the Cosmos DB provider, it knows how it will just automatically be able to do this. So if you have, if you specify a list of strings, it will persist the list of strings as JSON in the document database. So parity, I'm not going to go into this, but if you use group by in your queries, you'll be really happy because there's a lot more features for that. Take a look at the article for details on that. So I'm just putting a pin in your head that would hurt, an idea in your head just to be aware of the fact that there's some really good support for group by queries now. And especially for everybody who's been wanting to do use first or first by default with the grouped queries, because you couldn't do that because you couldn't get back the actual objects of the group, right? It used to only ever be able to give you aggregate information. If you're using ASP.NET Core apps and you're a little worried about the minimal APIs, EF Core 6 definitely supports that. This just the team goes back and forth with how this should work all the time. So I just want to make sure you can control the order of the columns as you're migrating when you're creating migrations. You can control how the columns are ordered in your database if you care. More flexible free text search, right? Boom, boom, boom. I'm just flying through this. And there's the team. Hi, guys. And also, I'm working on this also while I'm working on my Pluralsight course. I'm doing these YouTube videos, like I said, where I'm taking each of these topics and just saying as much as I want to about them. I have no constraints. So just doing the very first part, where I was only talking about the query performance, I spent almost an hour talking about it, right? Compiled models, I spent almost a half an hour talking about it. So one of these days I'll start doing more, and I won't be going, I got to hurry up and finish up. Anyway, course, I'm working on EF Core 6 fundamentals for Pluralsight. It's going to be, at least another month. And so you'll have this deck, so all the information in here will be there. And then, do we have time for some 6 minutes, right? Hard stop at 1:15. Okay, so that was what I wanted to run through, and now I want quickly to try to see if I can get to some of the questions. And if I'm looking at where, I'm scrolling through the comments. Looks like there were some, I disappeared. For how long? I disappeared at 1:59. Oh, only for 1 minute. Okay. I'm wondering how shall I handle these? All I can do is kind of scroll through these, and I guess I'll just go from the bottom up and see what happens. What about geometry support? I have no idea. That was not something that interested me, so I didn't happen to go look for it. Any news on free text support for SQLite? I don't know if that was just for SQL Server or not, so I don't know. Sorry. Yay, they fixed group by. See, there are a lot of people that was a bucket list item, right? For migrations, can I reorder columns using the column order attribute? And wait, they keep popping. Column order attribute in an existing table. I don't know. Not something I tried. So this is how having questions like this in my own head is how I learned so much about any framework core, right? Or any framework. Like, I wonder if this works. Well, I'll just try it out. So you guys and gals have some ideas that I haven't thought of before. So I'm trying to look at these questions, but the the stream of the chats keeps moving, so I'm trying to get up and it keeps going down. For migrations, can I reorder columns using the column? Okay, that one I don't know. Somebody answered a question. Thank you. Providing converters for custom types. Yes, I love being able to do that. Had small technical issues, super useful converters. When you do the migration table name, wait, oh no, where did it go? Okay. When you do, this is Andrew Harkins, when you do the migration table name to table is temporal, does this create the normal table and the temporal table? Yes. So the temporal table is that little history table inside. So it creates what it does the terminology that let's scroll back up there. System versioned, right? So what it does is it creates a system versioned table, and a system version table always has that history table in there. Okay, it keeps flying down to the bottom. The period start column for George Jetson is hidden behind Julie. Sorry about that. I've got 3 more minutes, so I'm just going to keep trying to go through. As long as your app won't live past December 31st, 9999. Well, Jamie Taylor, so anybody who was joking about that, I don't know if you've ever seen, at least on Twitter, when I'm talking about the fact that I'm still maintaining a 25-year-old Fox Pro app and a 20-year-old Visual Basic 6 app. So who knows, maybe my applications will go to $99.99. Let's see if I can temporal see, Andrew Chandler has been using temporal tables for 20 years. Like, can you believe I had never heard of them before? Maybe I'd heard them, the term fly by at one point. I'm going to do this so you can, no, that's not going to work. I was going to let you see where I'm scrolling up. Oh no, I lost my place again. I'm just going to randomly scroll up, and wherever it lands, it lands. Are you forced to use Visual Studio Code using Visual Studio 20? Yeah. So I forced myself to use Visual Studio Code, and probably Visual Studio would have handled the flipping between branches a lot better. That's for sure. Let's see, any others? Compiled models require undoing global filter. Is it temporary? Will we be able to do both? Oh, I didn't know about that. And I can't remember off the top of my head. What there? Oh, I know. The bulk conventions, there is a value conversions, the bulk value conversions. There is the way we could do them before, up until and through with EF Core 6 still, or the way we can do them when we're not doing bulk, there's a number of ways to apply them. And one of the ways wasn't working. I was like, this isn't working. It's not working. I don't know what I'm doing wrong. And it turns out that for the bulk conversions, they actually had to disable one of the ways of doing value conversions when you're trying to do it bulk won't work. This is just that slide that I was skipping over. It's just really interesting because this is a limitation that would have prevented pre-compilation from not being able to work. So like there was this one other, there was like 3 ways of applying conversions. And one of the ways of applying conversions that you can do a one-off with no problem, you can't do as a bulk conversion, specifically because it wouldn't work with a pre-compiled model. I thought that was interesting. It's scrolling back. Oh, it's 2:16. Hard stop at 2:15. my time. So somebody's talking. I guess I can't hear you. Am I the only one talking? I'd have to go to the YouTube to hear, I guess. Go to the YouTube link. See if Jim started talking and shut me up. Okay. Yeah, it's time. It's time for me to stop. And I'll just go back to the links if anybody's still looking.
Thanks, Julie. I'll remind you that we're very interested in your feedback about this webinar
But
and would
Mr.
appreciate you
Duffy,
taking a
there
moment
you
or two
are.
to complete our survey. It's all of 12 questions, so you'll fly right through it, and one lucky attendee will receive a $100 Amazon e-card. Mark your calendar for Wednesday, February 9th at 1 p.m. Eastern for our next Code Presents webinar, Git Basics. Hiring React developers. Come join the Code Consulting team. We have multiple junior and senior React positions currently open, remote and on-site. Full-time and contractor positions are available. Follow the link for all the details. Through our free hour of code offer, you can ask for our help on whatever you or your team needs. No strings, no commitment, no credit card required, just help from our code experts. Reach out to me about scheduling your free hour of code. The Code mobile app is available for both iOS and Android. It's the ideal way to read Code Magazine on the go. A free Code Magazine subscription is also available as a Microsoft benefit. Visual Studio subscription customers and Dev Essentials members qualify for a free Code Magazine subscription. That's it for today's presentation. Don't forget to like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter. If you're attending live, we will be in the chat for a while answering as many questions as possible. If you're watching this post-event recording, please don't hesitate to reach out to me or through any of our communications channels. We collaborate with Julie, so don't hesitate to reach out to me if you'd like her help on your project. Thanks for attending, everyone. Have a great rest of the day or night, wherever you are.